June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Dawn lifts a silver band off the horizon. The water is calm, but the sky is heavy with contrails. From Saipan's ridges, Japanese staff officers steady their binoculars and count until counting loses meaning. Carrier wakes crisscross the ocean like white lattice. Combat air patrols wheel in stacked rings. Below, transports and oilers steam in ordered columns that stretch beyond the curve of sight. This is not a task force. It is a moving coast. Radio intercepts confirm what the eye already knows. The American fleet has arrived in strength for Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas, and with it, the great carrier battle that will follow on 19 to 20 June 1944. 15 U.S. fleet and light carriers, screened by battleships and cruisers, throw nearly 1,000 aircraft into the sky. Mass guided by radar, discipline, and fuel without end. Behind those decks stands something larger and colder, a navy whose uniformed strength has already surged past 2 million by late 1943, with the total who will serve in WWRs exceeding 4.18 million by war's end, a scale the Imperial staff had never believed possible. For a long moment, the observers say nothing. The sea is quiet, only the machinery hums, and in that hum, they hear the verdict of a war decided by numbers long before guns can speak. If you want real World War II, verified dates, hard numbers, and battlefield truth, subscribe and hit the bell. Today's story begins now. The planners who sent Kido Butai east in late 1941 did not think they were gambling. They believed they were measuring. In Tokyo, the Navy General Staff, Gunraibu, built its war plans on a hard numerical spine. What the United States could field, how fast it could train, how long it would take to bring those forces west. In staff tables and estimate sheets, a number kept recurring for the U.S. Navy's uniformed strength, roughly 300,000. Contemporary American records show that on 7th of December 1941, the U.S. Navy actually had 337,349 on active duty, 35,160 officers, 301,589 enlisted. Japanese assessments clustered just under that figure. They were not prepared for what would follow. Inside Japan, the case for a short, decisive war rested on two pillars. First, that pre-war American numbers represented a ceiling in the near term. Second, that elite Japanese naval aviation could wreck U.S. striking power before those numbers could move. At the 7th Imperial Conference, 5th November 1941, ministers formalized the path to war after reviewing Draft A Draft B proposals and national policy papers, documents preserved today in Japan's diplomatic archives. The decision reflected confidence that carefully timed blows would outrun American mobilization. The opening blows appeared to validate the calculus. On 8th of December 1941, JST, Japan declared war and struck across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, with Pearl Harbor at its center. The edict and supporting papers, now accessible via JACAR, show a leadership convinced that speed could neutralize mass. For months, Japanese carrier divisions ranged almost unopposed. But those same archives also reveal the strategic assumption beneath the confidence, that America's naval expansion, even if inevitable, would be slow enough to manage if Japan seized a defensible perimeter quickly. Two figures framed the reality both sides faced at the start. The Imperial Japanese Navy listed 291,359 personnel in December 1941, including about 2,500 pilots, while the U.S. Navy sat near 337,000, a narrow gap that made a short war thesis seem plausible. Japanese doctrine, reconstructed by historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, assumed qualitative overmatch could offset early quantitative disadvantages. Tightly choreographed deck cycles, veteran air crews, and an operational art designed for the single. Decisive fleet action. Then the premise began to crack. Even before Midway, Washington had already set in motion a manpower and training surge unlike any the Pacific had seen. The annual report of the Secretary of the Navy, 1941, recorded a rapid climb from 244,606 on 30 Thuoders Stuati Turin. June 1941 toward the December. Totals. Evidence that the United States was already accelerating before the first torpedo struck. Behind those tables stood a mobilization apparatus the Japanese staff could not see in full. The Bureau of Naval Personnel, Naval Reserve Pipelines, and a training base meant to multiply. By mid-war, the divergence became a chasm. U.S. Navy leadership, Admiral Ernest J. King and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, tied operations to manpower timelines, ship deliveries, air group graduations, and base construction teams arriving on a schedule measured in months, not years. The Navy's own personnel history now records the scale. Between 7th Deck 1941 and 31 Deck 1946, 483,466 officers and enlisted served in the U.S. Navy, with reserve components making up the vast majority at peak. In narrative terms, that meant the Japanese were planning against a number near 300,000. Within 3 years, they were facing a Navy that would blow past 2 million on its way to well over 3 million at peak wartime strength. Every major operation made the gap visible. American amphibious forces needed sailors not only on warships, but in transport groups, service squadrons, advanced base sections, and the unglamorous auxiliaries that fed a moving ocean. Japanese staff estimates had accounted for ships. They had not fully reckoned with the human infrastructure of a global fleet. The result was mirror imaging, miscalculation, strategic failure, planning against what a Japanese system would require rather than what an American system could produce. Parshall and Tully's Midway study highlights that same doctrinal habit. Procedural excellence aimed at a battle Japan could not afford to fight twice. By 1943, the implications were undeniable on the map. U.S. carrier task forces rotated air groups without pausing the advance. New crews arrived as ships arrived. Service Squadron 10 turned forward anchorages into floating cities. For Japanese commanders who had once penciled $300,000 into their assessments, the lived experience was different. Convoy lanes filled with oilers, repair ships, and troop transports, crewed by an American Navy that no longer needed to count. And that is where the shock begins, an intellectual shock, before it became a tactical one, setting the stage for what those same commanders would witness at Operation Forager in Leyte. Mid-1944, by early 1942, the United States stopped thinking in terms of ships and started thinking in terms of systems. The change began with people. On 7 December 1941, the U.S. Navy had 337,349 on active duty, 35,760 officers, 301,589 enlisted. Within 4 years, the Navy would record 4,183,166 officers and enlisted who served between 7 DC 1941 to 31 Dec 1946, with wartime peak strength climbing into the multi-millions. The number that Japanese planners penciled as a ceiling became a floor. The acceleration was visible even before Pearl Harbor. The annual report of the Secretary of the Navy, 1941, shows active strength rising from 206,000 to 2018 on 30 June 1941, as reserve components and training pipelines expanded. Washington had already opened the valves. Once war began, the Bureau of Naval Personnel turned mobilization into a timetable. Recruit, train, deploy, repeated across dozens of schools and air stations. By 1945, Navy personnel strength stood at 3,280,817, a figure that captured the scale Japan could neither see nor match. Manpower fed hulls. Hulls fed operations. In the Central Pacific, the United States combined both into a moving infrastructure. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz received not just carriers, but the support to keep them forward indefinitely. Rear Admiral Worrall Reed Carter organized Service Squadron 10, commissioned in January 1944, to create floating bases that followed the fleet. Tankers, repair ships, tenders, water and ammo ships that turned atolls into cities. Carter commanded ServRon 10 from January 1944-31. July 1945. The quiet engine behind every advance. The result was tempo. When the United States launched Operation Forager, the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, on 15 June 1944, it brought an armada that exceeded anything in Japanese calculations. Task Force 58 mustered the fast carriers, attack transports, oilers, and escorts extended their reach. The Navy's own campaign histories define the sequence. Landings beginning 15 June, followed by the Battle of the Philippine Sea on 19th or 20th June 1944, the largest carrier action of the war. Numbers reveal what eyes on Saipan's ridges felt. U.S. carrier and light carrier decks launched hundreds of aircraft per cycle, guided by radar controllers who vectored F-6F intercepts against inbound raids. The order of battle reconstructed from CNSPAC, Com-Airpac rosters shows a meticulously layered screen of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, each with dedicated logistics tracks, an operational geometry the Imperial Navy could not reproduce by mid-1944. The causal chain was simple and merciless. Personnel surge, standardized shipbuilding, forward logistics, sustained operational tempo. Each link had a commander's name and a date. Ernest J. King squeezed shipyard output and prioritized carriers. Nimitz synchronized assaults with air group graduations and base construction battalions. Carter's ServRon 10 kept fuel and spares on tap within steaming distance of the line. When Japanese scouts finally reported the U.S. invasion force, they were not reporting a fleet. They were reporting a system, the American answer to distance, attrition, and time. By contrast, Japanese staff work assumed the enemy's numbers would grow at a manageable rate. They counted warships and aviators. They undercounted oilers, repair ships, and the sailors who crewed them. U.S. histories now make the asymmetry explicit. After decades of interwar austerity, about 90,000 personnel through much of the 1930s, the Navy exploded in size after 8 December 1941, absorbing reservists and new recruits at a pace no Axis planner had modeled. That is how a pre-war force of 337,000 became millions by the time of Forager. This was not abstract arithmetic. It translated into daily realities. Carrier air groups replaced losses without leaving station. Radar picket destroyers rotated fresh crews. Damaged ships received voyage repairs at forward anchorages instead of limping to Pearl Harbor. The H-Gram 032 summary of Forager, Philippine Sea ties those facts to dates. Saipan, D-Day, 15th of June, 1944. Carrier battle, 19th to 20th of June. 2 Japanese fleet carriers lost on 19th of June, all within a week that showcased what manpower plus logistics could do. In that single week, Japanese commanders saw the culmination of an American mobilization that had outgrown the very idea of fleet strength. Headcounts had become sea lanes, training tables had become flight decks, and the U.S. Navy's personnel curve, measured in millions by 1944-45, had become the quiet center of gravity of the Pacific War. The story now tightens, because the same numbers that powered Forager also shaped the psychology of the enemy who watched it unfold. The moment of realization would come in the air over the Marianas, and on the bridges of ships that suddenly felt very small. America's advantage began with headcount, but it won with conversion, turning raw numbers into a machine that could move across an ocean and never stop. On 7 December 1941, the U.S. Navy counted 337,349 on active duty, 35,760 officers, 301,089 enlisted. By war's end, 4,183, 2,466 officers and enlisted had served between 7 DC 1941 to 31, DEC 1946. That expansion is not a statistic. It is a blueprint. More sailors meant more hulls crewed, more auxiliaries manned, and more bases built forward. Precisely the variables Japanese staff tables underweighted. Two institutional moves turned mass into tempo. First, the Bureau of Naval Personnel scaled recruiting and training to a wartime cadence. Navy personnel strength crested in the multi-millions by 1944-45. The Navy's own public history puts total wartime manpower raised and sent to the fleet above 3.5 million by August 1945. Second, the Pacific Fleet created Service Squadron 10, commissioned 15th January 1944 under Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter to bring the base to the battle. Tenders, repair ships, oilers, ammunition ships, water distillers, all organized to anchor forward and keep carriers on station. Cause and effect is clear. Mass recruitment, crews for auxiliaries, fuel and repairs alongside the line, carriers that did not need to go home. The proof surfaced during Operation Forager. When U.S. forces opened the Marianas campaign on 15th June 1944, the fleet that appeared off Saipan, Tinian, Guam contained not just striking power, but the infrastructure of striking power. The Navy's own Forager histories and H-grams fix the sequence. D-Day Saipan, 15th June. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on 19th to 20th June 1944, Guam's landings postponed, and then executed with the same armada weeks later. Logistics dictated lethality. The number of sailors mattered because their ships, oilers, repair ships, and transports made a 1,000-mile supply line behave like a home port. For Japanese planners, who had penciled a U.S. naval force in the hundreds of thousands, the sightline in 1944 captured the error. The manpower surge created a second fleet behind the first. Oilers to refuel at sea, and ServRon 10 to patch flight decks and turbines without a yard. That is how a headcount line on a Washington chart became aircraft cycles over the Marianas and a radar picket screen that never went dark. Quantitatively, the Americans brought 15 carriers, 7 fleet, 8 light, and 900 carrier aircraft to the Philippine Sea. Qualitatively, they brought the sailors to keep every one of those decks alive for months. Causal chain. Personnel explosion, auxiliary fleets crewed, forward, floating bases. ServRon 10, uninterrupted carrier operations during Forager. The Japanese General Staff estimated an opponent. The Americans mobilized a platform. Strategy follows capacity. After Midway, Admiral Ernest J. King in Washington and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz at Pearl reoriented Pacific operations around what the industrial base could sustain, not merely what the battle line could win. The Navy's personnel series shows why that pivot was possible. Active strength exploding from a few 100,000 in 1941 to millions by 1945, while the total who would serve across the war reached 4.18 million. With that labor, the fleet could field Task Force 58, rotate entire air groups, and still keep fresh pilots, ordnance crews, and deck crews flowing to the front. Manpower did not just fill ships. It set the operational tempo. In Forager, tempo became geometry. The U.S. 5th Fleet's order of battle for 19 to 20 June 1944 lists 7 fleet carriers plus 8 light carriers, total 15, screened by 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 68 destroyers, and a trailing net of oilers and submarines. The Japanese mobile fleet sailed with 3 fleet plus 6 light carriers, total 9, and fewer trained air crews. The contents of the sky mirrored the rosters. The Americans put up 1,900 carrier aircraft. The Japanese, 450, with $300 more land-based. Result followed arithmetic. When Japan launched multi-wave strikes on 19th of June, U.S. F-6F interceptions and radar-directed gunnery destroyed hundreds of attackers. By the next day, Taihō and Shōkaku were sunk by U.S. submarines, USS Albacore and USS Kavala, and Hiyō followed under carrier strikes. That outcome was not a surprise to a staff reading the Bureau of Naval Personnel curves. A Navy with millions in uniform could absorb attrition, commission more escorts, and man more picket stations. A Navy with hundreds of thousands could not lose a day's worth of aircrew and remain a carrier navy. The Philippine Sea proved the rule. The Great Marianas turkey shoot was less a tactical anomaly than the operational signature of radar coverage, pilot training depth, and airgroup turnover that mass allows. Causal chain, personnel depth, pilot training pipelines and standardized air groups, sustained CAPI and radar control, air superiority kill ratios that shattered Japan's ability to regenerate. The commander names tie the links. King, production priorities; Nimitz, operational phasing; Mitscher, carrier tactics; Carter, ServRon, 10, sustainment. Dates fix the arc. D-Day, 15th of June, 1944. Carrier battle, 19th to 20th of June. Guam and Tinian taken in July-August 1944. Each step made possible by sailors counted not in hundreds of thousands, but in millions. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, Gunraibu, the early war spreadsheets looked reassuring. Personnel strength in December 1941 stood at 291,359, about 1,500 naval aviators, a cadre of elite deck crews, armorers and pilots trained in long pre-war syllabi. The planners believed the United States would mobilize slowly and could be shocked into negotiation. Their estimate line for U.S. naval manpower hovered in the hundreds of thousands. Reality outran it. By mid-1944, Japanese staff officers on Saipan and Guam were watching Operation Forager unfold. A U.S. armada with 15 fast carriers and 900 carrier aircraft covered by a wall of escorts. With the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 19-20 June 1944, destroying the bulk of Japan's remaining carrier air arm in 2 days. The causal chain was brutal. Mirror imaging, assuming the enemy organized like you, led to miscalculation of U.S. recruiting and training capacity. Miscalculation led to strategy that sought a one-time decisive clash. Strategy led to attrition Japan could not replace. Post-war U.S. Navy personnel records quantify the asymmetry. 337,349 on active duty on 7th DCT 1941 grew into millions in uniform. With 4,183,466 officers and enlisted passing through Navy service by DEC 1946, Japan's own growth from 291,359 DEC 1941 to Tinian 600 July 1945 came too late and too thinly trained to restore carrier aviation after the Marianas. When Task Force 58 arrived for Forager, Japanese commanders faced a new operational geometry. Service Squadron 10 had created floating bases that erased distance. American radar and fighter direction turned mass into kill ratios, and submarine screens reached into the Japanese rear. The Philippine Sea's ledger tells the staff story in steel. Taihō and Shōkaku sunk on 19th June 1944 by USS Albacore and USS Kavala. Hiyō lost to carrier strikes the same day, and hundreds of attacking aircraft shot down in what U.S. histories term the Great Marianas turkey shoot. The staff had predicted ships. They had not predicted a system. Cause, effect, underestimated U.S. manpower. Sakiderfistu, underestimated auxiliaries and forward repair, underestimated sortie endurance, shock at the scale of Forager, and the irreversible loss rates over the Marianas. For Japanese sailors and junior officers, the turning point was sensory before it was statistical. On 15th of June 1944, as U.S. Marines landed on Saipan, the view from island command posts showed transports, oilers, and warships layered to the horizon. 4 days later, the carrier air battle wiped out the air umbrella that made Japanese ships viable. Crews aboard Zuikaku and Junyo watched refueling lines, recovery cycles, and radar-vectored F-6F Hellcats operating in depth their own fleet could no longer replicate. In debriefs after the Marianas, staff officers did not just note lost aircraft. They recorded lost air groups, cadres that Japan's compressed training pipeline could not regenerate by late 1944. Numbers carried the emotion. U.S. Navy records for W02 service show a pipeline capable of millions processed through training and assignment by 1945. NHHC's Marianas Chronicle lists Saipan D-Day, 15th of June 1944, carrier battle, 19 to 20 June, and multiple island landings sustained within weeks. An operational tempo visible to any lookout. Against that, the IJN's personnel curve to about 5.8 CC set to 6 million, July 1945, masked a qualitative collapse. Fewer carrier-qualified aviators, fewer deck crews seasoned in cyclic operations, fewer radar controllers. The sailors could feel the gap in the way their ships had to retire to refuel or repair while the American decks kept flying. Cause? Effect? U.S. manpower throughput, persistent flight operations, and rapid unit rotation. Japanese crews confronting an enemy that did not pause, morale damage that no single tactical success could reverse. Japanese naval culture prized craftsmanship, endurance, and the decisive stroke at the appointed hour. In 1941-42, that creed produced real victories. But by 1944, the Pacific rewarded scale joined to systems. U.S. personnel tables, 337,349, active on 7th Deck 1941, expanding to millions, were not abstractions. They were the reason that after 19 to 20 June 1944, the Imperial Navy never again contested the Central Pacific on equal terms. The surviving Japanese carriers that limped away from the Marianas sailed into a world where even perfect courage could not refill a destroyed training pipeline. From bridge wings and island bunkers, officers who once predicted an American ceiling near 300,000 now watched a Navy whose wartime service total topped 4.18 million, and understood the moral of the numbers. Destiny cannot outvote a factory line. The psychological break was not drama, it was recognition. When Service Squadron 10's logistics web kept the U.S. fleet on station week after week, the idea of a single decisive battle died. What remained was a long subtraction problem that the IJN could not solve. Cause-effect, cultural commitment to the decisive battle, operational designs that required intact, elite air groups, Marianas attrition under U.S. mass, acceptance within the IJN that the war's outcome had passed from valor to volume. June 1944, Saipan, 0542. Black smoke from pre-8-hour bombardment drifts seaward as LVTs churn a gray corridor through surf. Overhead, combat air patrols stack in disciplined rings. On the western horizon, mastheads keep appearing, then more behind them, until the horizon itself looks serrated. The operation code is Forager. The objective is the Marianas. For the first time, Japanese island observers grasped the size of what the Imperial Navy must face to keep the Central Pacific closed. D-Day Saipan, 15th of June, 1944. Within 4 days, The carrier battle that staff officers have promised for 2 years will ignite. Force geometry. The American order of battle for the coming air fight is Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher. It fields 15 carriers, 7 fleet, and 8 light, screened by battleships, cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, with around 900 carrier aircraft spotted on deck and in hangars. On the other side, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet musters 9 carriers, 3 fleet, 6 light, with RAR 450 embarked aircraft and several hundred land-based planes in the Marianas. The numbers themselves are a tactic. More decks mean thicker cap, larger strike packages, and the ability to absorb losses without thinning the screen. June 1944, 10:40 to 2:35, first contact. Japanese search aircraft find the U.S. fleet. Ozawa orders the first of multiple long-range strikes, launched at the very edge of his air group's combat radius. American radar picks up the inbound raid at distance. Fighter directors vector F-6F Hellcats into layered intercepts well before the attackers reach the carrier screen. The first Japanese wave, roughly 60-plus aircraft, is broken in minutes. The pattern repeats. By mid-afternoon, hundreds of attacking aircraft have been shot down by radar-guided fighters and heavy AA. To U.S. gunners on the picket line, it feels like a drill. To Japanese aviators, like disappearance. The day acquires a name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. June, submarines decide a carrier duel. Even as the air battle rages, 2 U.S. submarines cut the heart out of Ozawa's striking power. USS Albacore, SS-218, torpedoes the brand-new armored carrier Taihō. Gasoline vapors later detonate, and she sinks with heavy loss of life the same afternoon. Hours later, USS Kavala, SS-244, puts torpedoes into Shōkaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. She explodes and sinks. In one day, Japan loses 2 of its 3 fleet carriers. The third, Hiyō, will follow under U.S. carrier strikes. Date stamp: 19th June 1944. Cause and effect: American mass in the air, plus U.S. undersea screen. An opponent deprived of decks faster than he can launch sorties. Operational causality, not coincidence. The shoot-down tallies and submarine successes were not isolated feats. They were the surface of a deeper machine. The U.S. Navy had the personnel depth to maintain 24-hour radar watches, man robust fighter direction teams, and keep AA crews fresh. The Navy's W.02 personnel series documents the foundation: 337,349 on active duty on 7-10-1941 expands to millions by 1944-45, with 483,466 officers and enlisted recorded as having served by war's end. More sailors meant more controllers, mechanics, and gunners at each node in the system. The hidden reason the first Japanese raid fell apart on radar scopes rather than over American flight decks. 19 June, 1830. Attrition becomes arithmetic. Ozawa's later waves launch anyway, at longer range, with fuel margins so thin that many aircraft ditch after missing their targets. Mitscher's cap cycles continue without collapse, because Service Squadron 10, commissioned January 1944 under Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter, keeps the fleet fueled, armed and repairable in theater. Destroyers top off from oilers. Damaged ships receive voyage repairs. Carriers keep cycling aircraft. Cause, effect. ServRon 10's forward base concept converts sailor headcount into persistent fighting time. June. The flight beyond darkness. With Ozawa withdrawing west, Mitscher authorizes an extreme-range evening strike. U.S. air groups attack near dusk, damage additional Japanese units, then find their way back by moonlight and homing beacons. In a gesture only a fleet certain of sea control would risk, Mitscher orders the task force to turn on the lights. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers illuminating the ocean to recover pilots after nightfall. It is a tactical act rooted in confidence and capacity. Enough ships, enough fuel, enough trained deck crews to accept the risk and still be ready at dawn. The view from the other bridge. For Japanese commanders who entered the war assuming an American ceiling near 300,000 sailors, the Marianas Week is not merely defeat, it is revelation. Contemporary U.S. Navy personnel histories confirm what their eyes now absorb. The Navy's wartime strength has surged into the millions, with the total served exceeding 4.18 million by DEC 1946. No plan that trades aircrew for time can survive that delta. Mirror imaging, miscalculation, strategic failure now has dates attached to it. 15th of June, Saipan landings. 19th and 20th of June, carrier battle, 3 Japanese carriers lost. July-August, Tinian and Guam secured. A run of outcomes driven as much by sailors and support ships as by pilots and carriers. Quantities that change behavior. Ozawa's post-battle reports concede the essence. Japan's carrier air arm is mortally weakened. Regeneration at pre-war training standards is impossible. Post-war compendia of IJN personnel indicate how late and shallow Japan's manpower expansion arrives from Ut 291,359, DEC 1941, to Auen 63,223 July 1945, a large number on paper, but too few carrier-qualified aviators and seasoned deck crews to translate it into recovered striking power. The Americans, by contrast, are already rotating fresh air groups and crew drafts forward on a timetable measured in weeks. What the week decided. By sunset on 20th of June 1944, the Imperial Navy still has ships, but it no longer has a carrier system. The U.S. fleet, by contrast, is a moving base with its own refineries, workshops, depots, and schools, and the sailors to run them. At staff tables in Tokyo, the earlier prediction line, a United States that might field 296,000 sailors, is now visibly off by an order of magnitude. The war will continue, but the curve has crossed. What remains is execution. The horizon over the Philippine Sea goes dark. The numbers do not. They will write the rest of 1944. Taru. Swan, Taru 23, June 1944. Staff reaction and orders. Back in Tokyo and on forward flagships, dispatches from the Marianas turned numbers into directives. The Navy General Staff, Gun Raibu, tallied the air loss returns and carrier sinkings from 1920 June and concluded what commanders already felt at sea. The carrier air arm, once the sword of the Empire, could no longer be regenerated to pre-war standards. Orders went out to conserve remaining decks and consolidate air training under emergency syllabi measured in weeks, not years. The cause was not mysterious. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had erased a generation of aviators. The training base could not replace them before autumn. Operational pivot, from striking force to decoy. Within 4 months, the logic of depletion shaped the plan for the next great battle. For Operation Shōgo, the defense of the Philippines, October 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda and Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa accepted a role for the remaining carriers that would have been unthinkable in 1942. The Northern Force would sail as a bait formation, its flight decks largely empty of trained air crews, to draw U.S. Third Fleet north and open a corridor for Vice ADM. Takeo Kurita's center force through the San Bernardino Strait. The decisive stroke Japan had cherished since Tsushima was reduced to a deception scheme because the air groups lost in June could not be rebuilt by October. Cause? Effect. Marianas attrition, collapse of carrier striking power. Carriers repurposed as lures at Leyte Gulf. 3-26, October 1944. Leyte Gulf validates the pivot. At Cape Engano, 25 October, Ozawa's decoy did its work and paid for it. Shōkaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor carriers, went down with Chitos, Toyoda, and Hiyō under massed strikes from Halsey's carriers. The dates and names tighten the arc that began in June. The Taihō Shōkaku Hiyō losses had destroyed the air that made carriers more than targets. Engano finished the hulls. In the same operation, Kurita briefly broke into Samar on 25 October, where U.S. escort carriers and destroyers fought a desperate action. But even there, the American system reasserted itself. Radar control, rapid refueling, and air replacement turned a near disaster into an Axis retreat by nightfall. Causality is continuous. June's air massacre made October's decoy plan inevitable. October's decoy plan made the final carrier losses unsurprising. Personnel arithmetic on the bridges. On Ozawa's flagship Shōkaku, survivor lists from June had already shown the scale of the deficit. By October, flight decks were spotted with aircraft that could launch only once. By contrast, Task Force 38, the fast carriers under Admiral William F. Halsey, arrived on station with fresh air groups, spare pilots, and the deck crews to cycle strikes until darkness. U.S. Navy personnel totals rising into the millions by 1944-45 and recording over 4.18 million officers and enlisted who served across, we explain why, a manpower base that could rotate skill, not merely replace losses. The Japanese Navy, which had begun the war near 291,000 personnel, DEC 1941, expanded on paper to by 1.66 million by mid-1945, but the qualitative center, carrier-qualified pilots, fighter directors, deck crews drilled in cyclic ops, had been burned out in the Marianas week. Cause-effect. Numbers without time for training remain numbers. Logistics keeps writing the script. In July-August 1944, even as the Marianas Islands fell, Saipan, 9th July, Tinian, 4th August, Guam, 10th August, the U.S. Pacific Fleet did not pause to refit in Hawaii. Service Squadron 10, commissioned January 1944 under Rear Adm. Worrell Reed Carter, kept a forward city of oilers, repair ships, ammunition ships, and tenders stepping west with the front. Destroyers that fought radar picket duty on 19–20th of June were topping off from oilers a week later. Carriers patched flight deck damage alongside depot ships and launched again. This is the hidden manpower story. Tens of thousands of sailors in the auxiliary train converting American headcount into days on station. Japanese commanders, who once imagined American ceilings near 300,000, now faced an opponent that made time its ally. Staff memoranda become admissions. Post-battle analyses within the combined fleet conceded that the pre-war theory of the decisive battle, Kantai-Kessen, required intact elite air groups and the initiative to choose the fighting ground. After 19–20 June 1944, neither remained true. Japanese staff tables still listed cruisers and battleships, but the sea had shifted to the carriers, and the carriers had shifted from striking to sacrificial use. The Marianas confirmed a harsher equation. Without trained air, a carrier is a liability. Without the industrial and personnel base to create trained air, a navy is an illusion. From shock to strategy, a closing loop. Between 15th June and 20th June, the IJN learned that American manpower had outgrown fleet counts and become an operating condition. Between 23 to 26th October, it learned the corollary. Even a brilliantly conceived surface ambush, Samar, could not reverse a theater run by replacement tables and logistics schedules. The same phenomenon linked both weeks. Mass turned into tempo. U.S. flight decks did not merely outnumber, they outlasted. Names that mark the hinge. Set them side by side, and the pivot is visible. King driving production and personnel policy. Nimitz phasing operations to training outputs. Mitscher executing radar-directed carrier tactics on 19–20 June. Carter's ServRon 10 sustaining it. Toyoda authorizing a carrier decoy because the air was gone. Ozawa sacrificing Shōkaku because the war demanded time he did not have. Each name sits on dates that frame the turning: June 1944, Forager, Philippine Sea, to October 1944, Leyte Gulf, a 4-month corridor in which manpower curves became battle outcomes, what the commanders finally knew. By the close of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy still had courage, ships, and charts. It did not have the people, not in the sense that mattered. The layered cadres of pilots, directors, ordnancemen, machinists' mates, and supply ratings that make a fleet fight every day. American figures, millions in uniform by 1944–45, with 4.18 million having served in the Navy across the war, were not trivia. They were the ceiling of every tactical possibility. Japanese officers who once predicted an American Navy capped near 296,000 sailors now looked out overseas where that estimate would not even crew the auxiliaries following a U.S. task force. The realization had begun in the contrails of 19–20 June. By the fires of 25 October, it was doctrine. The horizon did not get closer. The American fleet did, and behind it, an ocean of uniforms that would not run out. The week that began on 15th of June 1944 did more than seize the Marianas. It rewrote the Pacific's arithmetic. By the time Saipan, 9th of July, Tinian, 1st August, and Guam, 10–20 August, were secured, the United States had not only advanced 1,000 miles west, it had anchored an air-sea machine that could not be pushed back. The reason was visible on rosters, not maps. In December 1941, the U.S. Navy counted 337,349 on active duty, 35,760 officers, 301,589 enlisted. By 1945, Navy personnel strength stood at roughly 3.38 million, and the service's wartime compilations record 4,443 officers and enlisted who passed through Navy uniform. Between 7th December 1941 and 34 January 1946, that throughput is the quiet explanation for why Task Force 58–38 kept striking. Without pause from the Marianas to Formosa, October 1944, and into the Philippines. Leyte landings, 20 October 1944. There were always fresh deck crews to cycle, controllers to man radar, machinists' mates to keep turbines in trim, and ordnance teams to turn magazines faster than attrition could slow them. Japan's curve looks large until you compare the composition. The Imperial Navy counted about 281,000 uniformed personnel in December 1941. By July 1945, total naval personnel had climbed above 1.6 million. But after the 19–20 June slaughter of trained carrier aviators and the loss of Taihō, Shōkaku, and Hiyō, the surge could not rebuild what mattered. Carrier-qualified pilots, deck crews drilled in cyclic operations, and fighter direction teams practiced in radar control. Numbers gained after June 1944 were real and, strategically, too late. The effect appeared first in tempo. In July–August 1944, Service Squadron 10, commissioned January 1944 under Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter, moved its floating base into the Marianas and then westward, knitting together oilers, repair ships, destroyer tenders, ammunition ships, and depot vessels. This is manpower turned into time. Destroyers that had fought radar picket on 19-20th of June were refueled and back on station within days. Damaged carriers took voyage repairs alongside depot ships and resumed flight operations without a Hawaii yard period. A navy measured in the millions had enough sailors to keep the base at sea. It also appeared in replacement cycles. Carrier air groups that shot themselves thin over the Philippine Sea received fresh pilots and aircraft before the next phase opened. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz could time Operation Forager's follow-on strikes and landings to the graduation dates of training pipelines ashore. Admiral Ernest J. King's production priorities: standardized Essex-class carriers, identical auxiliaries, common spares, made personnel fungible. A crew trained on one deck could function on another in hours, not months. The cumulative result is why 3rd Fleet, TF-38, could hammer Formosa in October 1944, support Leyte a week later, and still generate the massed strikes that destroyed Ozawa's decoy carriers at Cape Engano, 25 October 1944. Post-Marianas Japan could not answer tempo with shock. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's remaining carriers sailed into Leyte Gulf as bait because there was no longer an air arm to swing. Admiral Soemu Toyoda's Shogo plan mortgaged carriers to buy a surface opening for Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita through San Bernardino Strait, even where Japanese tactics were bold. Samar, 25th of October. The American system closed the window. Escort carriers flew continuous sorties, destroyers refueled forward, and reinforcements navigated by a radar and oiler lattice that existed because there were enough people to run it. The manpower gap radiated into every supporting column. Amphibious lift increased because attack transports, LSTs and LCTs had full crews. Underway replenishment quickened because fleet oilers sailed in numbered strings. Aircraft readiness rose because maintenance ratings arrived in drafts sized to theater needs. Each was a line on a spreadsheet in Washington. Together, they were the shape of the war at sea. By late 1944, American commanders had what Japanese planners of 1941 never imagined: the margin to make mistakes and continue, to take damage and accelerate, to fight a campaign and prepare the next while still at sea. Personnel also changed psychology. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoots headline, "Hundreds of Japanese aircraft downed on 19 June, was devastating. But the quieter figure was more decisive. The U.S. Navy could still schedule and staff another operation 2 weeks later. That is what Japanese staff officers on the Marianas Ridges felt when the horizon would not empty. They were not seeing ships. They were seeing a nation's manpower made manifest. By year's end, the geometry of the Pacific had been simplified to one variable: endurance. The United States had it, quantified in millions of sailors, standardized hulls, and a forward logistics city at sea. Japan did not, quantified in late war headcounts that could not purchase trained air, nor rebuild shattered carrier organizations in the calendar that remained. The ledger from June to October 1944 tells the story without adjectives. 3 Japanese fleet light carriers sunk in the Philippine Sea. 4 more sacrificed at Cape Engano, and the U.S. Navy still cycling strikes and landings on schedule. The numbers had crossed in June. The outcomes followed through autumn. The final consequences would appear in the winter of 1944-45, when the same machine aimed itself at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, operations whose dates, troop lists, and ship counts would put a last, cold precision on what Japanese commanders had already understood in the Marianas sky. The winter of 1944-45 pressed the arithmetic to its conclusion. From the Marianas, the United States aimed its carrier machine at Iwo Jima, 19th of February 1945, and Okinawa, 13 April 1945. Operations that depended on manpower measured not by a single fleet, but by an ecosystem of sailors. The reason those dates could be set and kept was simple. The personnel base existed to staff every link in the chain: carriers, escorts, oilers, repair ships, and advance bases, continuously. The U.S. Navy's official personnel record puts the scale in one line: 4,183,466 officers and enlisted served in W2TC, 7 Dec 1941, 31 Dec 1946, with 337,349 on active duty on 7 Dec 1941 and wartime strength soaring into the millions by 1944-45. Japan's ledger shows a late, painful climb. The Imperial Japanese Navy rose from 291,359 personnel, Dec 1941, to 1,063,223, July 1945, a huge figure that hid a qualitative drought. The pilots burned over the Marianas in June 1944 were not just numbers. They were the irreplaceable center of carrier warfare. The July 1945 total could crew ships, but it could not recreate air groups trained to pre-war standards. Cause? Effect? Numerical expansion after mid-1944. Without the training calendar to mature specialists meant a larger navy that fought smaller. The contrast sharpened in the operations that followed Forager. Between Saipan D-Day, 15th June 1944, and the delayed Guam landings, postponed beyond the original 18 June plan due to the Philippine Sea air battle, the United States demonstrated a capacity to pause nothing. Oilers kept cycling. Repair ships turned voyage fixes. Fresh air groups arrived on schedule. The Navy's own Forager Chronicle records that Guam's assault slipped over a month, while the fleet annihilated Ozawa's air arm, then executed anyway with the same armada. Cause? Effect: manpower. ServRon logistics. The ability to absorb a carrier battle and still launch 2 amphibious invasions in the same campaign plan, and the Philippine Sea itself had rewritten how Japan fought. The order of battle that June, USN-7 fleet plus 8 light carriers, DA 900 aircraft, versus IJN-5 fleet plus 4 light, IJS 450 embarked, translated into kill ratios and, more decisively, into time on station. 2 U.S. submarines, USS Albacore, USS Kavala, removed Taihō and Shōkaku on 19th June 1944. Hiyō followed to carrier strikes. Those sinkings were tactical dramas mounted on a strategic stage built by personnel and logistics. A fleet with millions in uniform could keep radar watches, fighter direction nets, and AA batteries manned at full alert for days. That is not a single battle edge. It is a manpower edge expressed through doctrine. By October 1944, the logic reached Leyte Gulf. Admiral Soemu Toyoda's Shogo plan sent Ozawa's carriers north as a decoy, conceding the loss of true carrier striking power. Off Cape Engaño, 25 OCT. Shōkaku, last survivor of Pearl Harbor's strike force, went down with Chitos, Toyoda, and Zuiho under waves from Task Force 38. NHHC's retrospective on Leyte frames the moment through the crews who launched again and again that day. A rhythm only possible when deck crews, ordnance men, and pilots can be rotated, not exhausted. Cause, effect. The June manpower dark air power deficit forces carriers into bait. October finishes the carrier hulls that June had emptied of air. Meanwhile, the United States kept writing new schedules. ServRon 10, commissioned January 1944 under Rear Admiral Worrall Reed Carter, shifted its floating base west with the front. Carter detached from command 34th July 1945, with the mission essentially complete. His biography reads like a footnote until you map it onto the campaign timeline. The invisible city of tenders, repair ships, and oilers that made an army of decks behave like a single ship with infinite endurance. Cause, effect, appoint a logistics admiral, staff his squadron with thousands of sailors, convert distance into availability. Post-war assessments from both sides converged on the same conclusion. Japan's pre-war faith in the decisive battle, Kantai-Kessen, required trained carrier air and the initiative to choose where to fight. After 19 to 20 June 1944, neither condition existed. America's personnel base turned ship counts into systems, and systems into tempo. By 1945, the question wasn't whether the U.S. Navy could mount another operation. It was which week it preferred. The final personnel totals: USN Wartime Service 4.18 million, IJN July 1945, 1.66 million. Quantify what Japanese commanders had already understood on Saipan's ridges. They had predicted an opponent of 296,000 sailors, then met a navy scaled beyond counting. The guns would keep firing into 1945. The decision, measured in uniforms, was already made. And the last pages of the Pacific War would only spell out what the Marianas sky had said in June. History remembers the sound first. Engines layered over engines, flight decks that did not sleep, a horizon that looked like a coastline but moved. Japan entered the Pacific War believing precision could outrun mass. In December 1941, that faith seemed justified. The Imperial Navy counted roughly 291,000 in uniform and an elite corps of carrier aviators who had trained for years. The United States stood near 337,349 sailors on the day of Pearl Harbor. The gap looked bridgeable. The plan felt possible. But the Pacific does not honor plans. It honors arithmetic. By June 19, 1944, when the carrier air arm shattered over the Marianas, the war's center of gravity had already shifted. The U.S. Navy had turned people into a system. Radar controllers, deck crews, machinists' mates, oilers, repairmen, so that a fleet could fight without pause. And by war's end, 483,466 officers and enlisted had served in Navy uniform. A number that large does not merely fill ships. It changes what a Navy is. What Japanese commanders saw from Saipan's ridges was not just power, it was permanence. They had predicted an opponent measured in hundreds of thousands. They met a machine staffed in millions. They had planned for a decisive battle. They discovered a decisive tempo. The decisive battle creed, Kantai-Kessen, requires trained air, chosen ground, and time to prepare. The Marianas removed all three. There is a human truth inside the numbers. Sailors on both sides believed in their ships. They believed in duty and in the craft of their work. None of that was small, but the outcome was written by the hands that could be replaced, the watches that could be stood, the decks that could be manned again at dawn. That is not a dismissal of courage. It is its measure in an industrial war. So the story ends not in triumphal noise, but in a quiet recognition. That belief, when it meets capacity, must learn humility. That the Pacific was won by a nation that could make tomorrow look like today, every day, until the enemy's calendar ran out. The sea is calm again. The numbers are not. And across that water, the lesson holds. Perfection fades. Systems endure. What the eye saw in June 1944, and what the ledgers confirmed after, was the moment an ocean learned to count. If this story helped you see the war more clearly, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which operation or weapon you want next. See you on the next mission.